There comes a moment in life when the pain you spent years running from suddenly becomes impossible to silence, not because it grew louder overnight, but because something inside you finally became quiet enough to hear it. For most of your life, you survived by distracting yourself from your own emotional wounds. You stayed busy, you stayed available, you stayed strong for everyone else while silently collapsing within yourself. You called it responsibility, you called it maturity, you called it being resilient. But deep inside, your body was carrying grief your mind refused to acknowledge, and eventually, the soul always demands honesty. The second awakening begins when your suffering no longer feels normal. The exhaustion becomes heavier than your ability to pretend. The loneliness becomes deeper than the comfort of staying surrounded by the wrong people. The anxiety becomes impossible to explain away. You wake up one day and realize you are tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. Because this exhaustion was never physical. It came from years of suppressing your truth just to keep peace in environments that were slowly destroying you. You start noticing how often you abandon yourself just to avoid disappointing others. How many times you said yes while your entire body was screaming no. How many relationships survived only because you kept betraying your own needs. And suddenly, the life you once fought so hard to maintain begins to feel unbearable. Not because you are weak, but because your awareness is growing stronger than your conditioning. Awakening does not begin with peace. It begins with discomfort. It begins with the terrifying realization that you can no longer live disconnected from yourself. The things that once numbed you stop working. The approval that once satisfied you feels empty. The roles you played for survival begin to suffocate you. You realize you were never living freely. You were adapting, performing, pleasing, enduring, becoming whoever you needed to become in order to feel accepted, safe, or loved. And the hardest part is realizing how early this survival began. Many people learned as children that love had conditions attached to it. You learned that being emotional made you too sensitive, that expressing needs made you difficult, that saying no created rejection, so you became hyper-aware of everyone else's emotions while abandoning your own. You learned how to read rooms before you learned how to read yourself. You became the caretaker, the peacemaker, the overachiever, the invisible one, not because it was your true nature, but because survival taught you that authenticity was dangerous. Years later, your adult life still reflects those wounds. You over-explain because you fear being misunderstood. You overgive because you fear being abandoned. You tolerate disrespect because deep down you still believe losing people would hurt more than losing yourself. And eventually, the pain of self-abandonment reaches a breaking point. That breaking point is not your destruction, it is your awakening. Because the moment you can no longer tolerate the life that once kept you emotionally asleep is the exact moment healing quietly begins. The pain you feel is not evidence that you are broken. It is evidence that your soul is refusing to stay numb any longer. What hurts is not only what happened to you. What hurts is realizing how long you convinced yourself it was acceptable. You begin grieving the years you spent shrinking yourself to fit inside other people's comfort. You grieve the relationships where you gave everything and still felt unseen. You grieve the version of yourself that thought suffering was proof of loyalty. You grieve how often you ignored your intuition just to keep people from leaving. And grief like this changes a person forever. Because once you truly see your pain, you cannot unsee it. You start recognizing how trauma shaped your identity, how fear disguised itself as love, how anxiety disguised itself as responsibility, how perfectionism disguised itself as worthiness. You realize you spent years trying to earn the right to exist without guilt, trying to become good enough for people who were emotionally incapable of loving you properly in the first place. And this realization creates anger, not toxic anger, sacred anger, the kind of anger that finally says, I deserved better than what I accepted. The kind of anger that begins breaking generational cycles. The kind of anger that stops apologizing for having emotional needs. Because awakening is not becoming someone new. Awakening is remembering who you were before pain taught you to disconnect from yourself. For the first time, you begin listening to your body instead of overriding it. You notice the tension in your chest around certain people. You notice how drained you feel after pretending to be okay. You notice the exhaustion that comes from constantly performing strength while carrying silent heartbreak. And slowly, you stop forcing yourself to tolerate what your spirit no longer aligns with. This is why awakening feels lonely before it feels freeing. Because your nervous system starts rejecting environments your old self was trained to survive inside. Conversations become harder to fake. Relationships become harder to maintain. You no longer have the energy to entertain emotional manipulation, shallow connections, or one-sided loyalty. The mask becomes too heavy to wear, and people may not understand your transformation. Some will call you distant because you stopped overextending yourself. Some will call you selfish because you finally created boundaries. Some will say you've changed because your pain no longer allows you to participate in your own emotional destruction. But healing often disappoints the people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. The second awakening is painful because it forces you to meet yourself without distractions. No more blaming, no more escaping, no more pretending, just truth. Raw, uncomfortable truth. And truth changes everything. You begin realizing that your entire life cannot be built around avoiding rejection. You stop measuring your worth by how needed you are. You stop chasing people who only notice your value once you begin walking away. You stop seeing your sensitivity as weakness and start understanding it was the part of you that remained human despite everything you survived. And slowly, the pain that once felt unbearable becomes the doorway to your transformation. Not because it disappears immediately, but because you stop fighting what it came to teach you. You stop asking, "Why am I falling apart?" And you begin asking, "Why did I spend so many years believing I had to abandon myself just to be loved?" There is a painful moment in healing when you begin realizing that what you once called love was often attachment born from fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being alone, fear of not being chosen. And this realization shakes the foundation of your entire emotional world because you suddenly understand that many of your deepest relationships were not built on mutual peace, safety, or truth. They were built on survival. For years, you confused emotional intensity with love. You thought constantly thinking about someone meant they were important to your soul. You thought anxiety meant passion. You thought waiting, chasing, proving, sacrificing, and tolerating pain were signs of commitment. But attachment speaks the language of fear, while love speaks the language of freedom. And until you heal the wounds inside you, attachment can easily disguise itself as devotion. Attachment says, "I need you so I can feel whole." Love says, "I choose you while still remaining connected to myself." Attachment is terrified of loss because it believes losing someone means losing identity, worth, or safety. Love understands that connection should never require self-destruction, but many people were never taught the difference. They grew up believing love had to be earned through performance, silence, sacrifice, or emotional endurance. So they entered relationships carrying childhood wounds disguised as loyalty. They became addicted to emotionally unavailable people because inconsistency felt familiar. They confused longing with connection because their nervous system had learned to chase what it could never fully receive. They stayed in relationships where they felt emotionally starved because deep inside, they believed love was supposed to hurt. And the second awakening begins when you finally see the pattern. You begin noticing how much of your love was actually fear of being left behind. How often you stayed attached to people who repeatedly wounded you simply because the thought of losing them felt unbearable. You tolerated disrespect, not because you lacked intelligence, but because your nervous system had associated emotional pain with emotional connection long before you became an adult. This is why awakening feels heartbreaking, because you are not only grieving people, you are grieving illusions. You are grieving the fantasy that if you loved hard enough, sacrificed enough, waited long enough, someone would finally choose you in the way you always needed. You are grieving the younger version of yourself that believed overgiving could secure safety. You are grieving the exhausting cycle of trying to earn what should have been freely given. And suddenly, your relationships begin looking different through awakened eyes. You start recognizing how attachment made you abandon yourself, how you ignored red flags because loneliness felt scarier than disrespect, how you stayed loyal to people who only loved the version of you that required nothing, how you silenced your needs to avoid conflict, how you accepted emotional breadcrumbs while convincing yourself you were asking for too much. But love never asks you to disappear in order to keep someone comfortable. Real love does not make you afraid to express emotions. It does not punish vulnerability. It does not leave you emotionally starving while demanding endless understanding from you. Love creates safety. Attachment creates anxiety. Love allows honesty. Attachment survives through fear and control. And when you begin healing, your body starts recognizing the difference before your mind fully understands it. You begin feeling exhausted around people you once chased endlessly. You begin noticing how certain relationships only survive when you betray your own boundaries. You begin realizing that some people were never attached to the real you. They were attached to your ability to overextend, overgive, overforgive, and overstay. This awareness changes everything, because once you stop confusing attachment with love, you stop romanticizing suffering, you stop calling emotional inconsistency chemistry, you stop calling emotional unavailability mysterious, you stop calling emotional neglect independence, you stop shrinking yourself to fit into relationships that only work when you are silent about your pain. And this transformation feels terrifying at first because attachment always fears separation. Even unhealthy attachments can feel emotionally addictive. Your mind may know someone hurts you, but your nervous system still craves the familiarity of the connection. This is why people often return to relationships that break them, not because they enjoy pain, but because pain became emotionally familiar long before they understood what healthy love looked like. Healing forces you to confront this truth. You begin asking yourself difficult questions. Was it really love if you constantly felt unsafe expressing your needs? Was it really love if you had to beg for consistency? Was it really love if your self-worth depended entirely on their validation? Was it really love if losing them felt like losing yourself completely? And for many people, the answer shatters them, because they realize they spent years fighting to keep connections that were slowly destroying their spirit. They realized they were emotionally attached to potential, fantasy, hope, memories, or trauma bonds rather than genuine intimacy. They realized they confused being needed with being loved. They realized they kept trying to heal childhood wounds through adult relationships that only repeated the same emotional injuries. But awakening changes your standards. You begin craving peace more than intensity. You begin valuing consistency more than temporary passion. You begin understanding that healthy love does not feel like constantly proving your worth, and slowly your definition of love transforms. Love becomes honesty without fear. Love becomes safety without control. Love becomes connection without losing individuality. Love becomes being fully seen without needing to perform for acceptance. Most importantly, love begins with yourself, because the deepest shift happens when you stop abandoning yourself in the pursuit of being chosen by others. When you stop begging for crumbs while calling it loyalty. When you stop measuring your worth by how difficult someone is to keep. When you finally understand that being loved should not require betraying your own emotional reality. This is where true healing begins. Not when someone finally chooses you, but when you finally choose yourself enough to walk away from what keeps breaking you. And the moment that happens, attachment slowly loses its power. Because you no longer confuse emotional suffering with connection. You no longer mistake anxiety for intimacy. You no longer call survival love just because it feels familiar. You begin realizing that real love never demanded your silence, your self-erasure, or your pain in exchange for belonging. There is a version of you that survived by becoming someone the world could accept, someone agreeable, someone useful, someone emotionally manageable, someone who learned very early that being fully authentic was not always safe. And for years, that version of you carried your life forward. It smiled while hurting. It stayed quiet while breaking. It tolerated what it should have walked away from, because survival taught you that losing yourself felt safer than losing connection. But eventually the soul grows tired of pretending, and that is when the second awakening begins. Not with clarity, not with peace, but with the painful collapse of the identity you built to survive. You begin feeling disconnected from the person you used to be. The things that once excited you suddenly feel empty. The relationships you once fought to keep begin feeling emotionally exhausting. Conversations become harder to fake. You notice yourself pulling away from environments where you once forced yourself to belong. And deep inside, a quiet panic starts rising because you no longer recognize the version of yourself that everyone else is familiar with. This is the terrifying part of transformation that nobody talks about. The old self does not disappear gracefully. It fights for survival, because the personality you created through trauma believes it is protecting you. The people pleaser believes it is keeping you loved. The perfectionist believes it is keeping you worthy. The overthinker believes it is keeping you safe. The emotionally numb version of you believes it is preventing pain. Every coping mechanism you developed once served a purpose. It helped you survive situations that overwhelmed your nervous system. It helped you endure rejection, criticism, neglect, abandonment, chaos, or emotional unpredictability. But survival identities eventually become prisons. And one day, your soul begins rejecting the very patterns that once protected you. You notice how exhausted you feel after pretending to be okay. You notice how heavy it feels to constantly shape yourself around other people's expectations. You notice how much energy it takes to suppress your truth just to avoid conflict, rejection, or disapproval. And slowly, the mask begins cracking. At first, this feels like losing yourself, but in reality, you are losing the false self you were forced to become. The second awakening is painful because it feels like a death happening inside a living body. Your old identity begins collapsing before your new identity fully forms. You no longer resonate with your old patterns, but you have not yet fully stepped into who you are becoming. This creates emotional confusion, loneliness, emptiness. You may wonder why you suddenly feel disconnected from everything that once defined your life. But what if this emptiness is not failure? What if it is space being created for your authentic self to finally emerge? For years, many people built their entire identity around survival. They became what others needed them to be. They prioritized being accepted over being real. They learned how to perform emotional strength while silently carrying unbearable pain. They became hyper-independent because vulnerability once led to disappointment. They became caretakers because their own emotional needs were ignored. They became achievers because accomplishment felt safer than intimacy. And after a while, they forgot who they were underneath all those adaptations. This is why awakening feels so disorienting. Because when the false self starts dying, you realize how much of your life was built around fear rather than truth. Fear of abandonment, fear of judgment, fear of not being enough, fear of being fully seen, fear of disappointing others, fear of existing without constantly proving your worth. And suddenly, the identity you spent years protecting begins feeling unbearable to carry. You start craving honesty more than approval, peace more than validation, authenticity more than belonging. And this shift changes everything. You stop laughing at things that hurt you. You stop tolerating relationships that require self-betrayal. You stop apologizing for needing rest, space, boundaries, or emotional honesty. You stop forcing yourself to remain connected to people who only valued the version of you that stayed silent about pain. And people notice the change. Some become uncomfortable when you stop shrinking yourself. Some accuse you of changing because your healing no longer allows easy access to your energy. Some only liked the wounded version of you because it was easier to control, easier to guilt, easier to manipulate. But the moment you begin reconnecting with your authentic self, unhealthy dynamics start collapsing naturally. Because the real you cannot survive inside spaces built for your self-abandonment. And still, despite this transformation, grief remains part of the process. You grieve the old identity even when it was hurting you. You grieve the relationships tied to that identity. You grieve the years spent disconnected from your own needs. You grieve how long you believed your survival mask was your personality. This grief can feel overwhelming because healing is not just gaining yourself back. It is mourning every version of yourself that had to suffer in silence to keep going. You begin remembering how often you ignored your intuition just to stay loved. How often you silenced your emotions because you feared rejection. How often you accepted emotional crumbs while convincing yourself you were asking for too much. And suddenly, the person you used to be starts feeling unfamiliar. Not because you are becoming cold, but because you are becoming real. The second awakening strips away illusions. It removes the emotional armor you once depended on. And without that armor, you may temporarily feel exposed, uncertain, and emotionally raw. But this vulnerability is not weakness. It is evidence that you are finally reconnecting with the parts of yourself you buried for survival. The authentic self does not emerge through comfort. It emerges through truth, through painful honesty, through confronting the patterns that once controlled your life, through realizing that many of your choices came from wounds, not freedom. And the deeper you heal, the less willing you become to betray yourself for temporary acceptance. You stop chasing people who require you to earn basic respect. You stop forcing connection where there is no emotional safety. You stop explaining your worth to those committed to misunderstanding you. You stop needing everyone to approve of your transformation. Because something inside you finally understands that peace is more valuable than performance. And little by little, the real you begins returning. The version of you that existed before survival became your identity. The version of you that feels deeply without shame. The version of you that no longer apologizes for taking up space. The version of you that trusts intuition instead of abandoning it. The version of you that no longer confuses suffering with love. The version of you that does not need to perform exhaustion in order to feel worthy. This rebirth is quiet at first, not dramatic, not loud, just small moments where you begin choosing yourself in ways you never could before. Moments where you say no without guilt. Moments where you stop over-explaining your boundaries. Moments where you allow yourself to rest instead of constantly proving your value through sacrifice. Moments where you realize you no longer want to survive life. You finally want to live it. And the person you once were slowly fades away, not because they were weak, but because they carried pain for so long that becoming someone else was the only way they knew how to survive, until the real you was finally strong enough to return